government media complex. I hope to prove to you over the next period of time that perhaps never before in American history has there been so cozy a relationship, and this, by the way, transcends right or left, has nothing to do with race, has nothing to do with politics, it has everything to do with press freedom. And I want to state that from the outset. I believe that today we have a relationship that is too cozy between government and media. Many of the speeches that are given before the Commonwealth Club, many of them, are picked up and rebroadcast by the local NPR radio station. Do you see any NPR people here? No. Many of the speeches given before the Commonwealth Club are transmitted on C-SPAN, which is paid for by the cable companies. Do you see any C-SPAN cameras here? Beware the government media complex. You know, the media, ladies and gentlemen, as you well know, is needed by you and by me, by the public, very badly needed, to be and to remain a thorn in the side of the government. In order to keep the government relatively honest, you need a media that's constantly poking at them. However, when the media instead becomes a thorn in the side of the skeptical private citizen, the media then becomes an arm of the government. Beware the government media complex. When agitators for the homeless riot, when they burn trash cans, they break the law, but they're held up as freedom fighters for the poor by the left-leaning press. But if one compassionate conservative dares to speak out, he's condemned to the gulag of media silence, the gulag of media exile. This startling bias in the media is more threatening to the pillars of our republic than even the most ardent conservative might believe. It is censorship by default as well. What do I mean by censorship by default? Where the commercial interests of the media, moguls, are so intertwined with government policy as to create an overly friendly image of government officials and their policies. So it may not be as clear as a conspiracy to bias the news, but it comes out to be the same thing anyway. Now, this bias is not limited to the left. It is largely a product of left-wing bias when it comes to certain social issues, such as affirmative action or gay rights. But the right also biases the news when it wants to shade fiscal issues to their benefit. Example, Rupert Murdoch and the China scandal. I first began this file on the government media complex about 3 years ago. I noticed an alarming bias occurring, and I knew that without correction, this could sink the ship of truth. Now, surely other administrations have had their friends in high media places, but still, there were many voices and many views of dissent which found their way into the national media. But now we have a growing media blackout of some serious crimes and misdemeanors, all unsolved to the satisfaction of those with critical powers of reason. Take any major policy issue, and you're going to see the government's official line reflected by the media elite. Let's look at some issues. Affirmative action, immigration, legal and illegal, the drug epidemic. How often do you hear about it? You hear a constant refrain, for example, about the dangers of tobacco. How often do you hear about the crack epidemic, the growing use of marijuana, the heroin epidemic? You hear about it, but all you really hear about is tobacco, tobacco, tobacco. Welfare, the so-called homelessness issue, taxes. Each and every issue as reflected in the old-line news media, that's TV network news and established newspapers and news magazines, is a parallel reflection of official policy. Listen to this carefully, if you will, and tell me if you agree. Hoover Institution historian Robert Conquest said that in the former Soviet Union, the press was totally under the control of the state. All editors were members of the Communist Party. Here in the United States of America, a frighteningly imbalanced Washington press corps exists. The media is needed by the public to be and to remain a thorn in the side of the government in order to keep the government relatively honest. But when the media instead becomes a thorn in the side of the skeptical private citizen, the media then becomes an arm of the government. Is this not worrisome? Beware the government media complex. In the next few minutes, I want to give you some examples of what I mean. In the 1950s, President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned Americans to beware the military-industrial complex. And this became a rallying cry for anti-military liberals for over 3 decades. Today, the warning should be very aware of the deeply incestuous relationship between media tycoons, their talking heads, and their federal government counterparts. Which is the tail? Which is the dog? Follow the money. Never before have so few controlled so many image and word outlets. Is it a monopoly? You bet. It grows each day, my file on this connection. We must ask the question, will the market shape up the media? Ladies and gentlemen, despite competition, the newsrooms are not taking the hints. We have talk radio has evolved, building a huge audience. We have the internet has evolved, attracting a huge audience. The circulation of the newspapers are plummeting across the country. Yet the newsrooms don't seem to be understanding what is going on. Why is that? Well, it could include sloppiness. It could be because of sensationalism. It could be because, though, of political bias. I think it's because of political bias. I think that the old media's bias and the lawyers who control the newsrooms in cahoots with the owners are responsible for this lack of response to the public's outcry. There was an obituary for a journalist in the New York Times. I love reading obituaries. I guess I've reached that age, and I wonder who'll publish my obituary when the time comes. I guess many people in the audience do that after a certain age, and you wonder if you're going to be covered by anybody when you pass on and what people will say about you. Well, this is an interesting obituary. Norman E. Isaacs, age 89, died. His name, I never heard of him. It said, journalist and expert on newspaper issues. I read further, and here was his claim to fame. It said that in 1969 and 70, he was president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, and in that role he charged in a speech that the Nixon administration was seeking to intimidate and muzzle the American press and television. Well, as you well know, because he did that in 69 and 70, he warned America about Nixon's draconian attempts to control the press. He went right up to the stellar heights of the media. And there was a beautiful obituary written for Mr. Isaacs in the New York Times. Beware the government media complex. Now, look, I have a bias. I go on the radio every day and I say, I have a somewhat conservative bias, and I'm open about that. Why doesn't the New York Times just say, we have a bias, so it comes with a warning label. Beware the government media complex. Stories every day. Here's another story out of the New York Times. The strange case of faked hate crimes. Do you remember, for about a year, we were told that black churches were burning in the South. That's all the news ran. Black churches were burning in the South. Now, we're all against the burning of churches, whether they're black or white, the burning of mosques or synagogues. There's nothing fundamentally more un-American than burning a house of worship. But the press kept running the story, black churches are burning in the South. Well, about a year and a half after this story appeared, and kept reappearing by the mainstream old-line press, the FBI did an intense study of the church burnings. And what they found was many of the burnings were set by their own ministers in order to collect insurance. They also discovered that many of the churches that were burnt were not predominantly black. They were also churches attended by white parishioners. Did you read a follow-up story in the mainstream press which said, sorry folks, they were not black churches which were burning, there were churches in general, and there was some arson involved? No, because they'd never admit their mistake. Here's another story. Right after TWA Flight 800, the investigation of it, the explosion of Flight 800, there was a huge study done by one of the agencies of the government. What witnesses believed to be missiles streaking toward the plane, we were told by the New York Times, were actually the flames and fire trails left by the plane's breakup. That's very interesting. The FBI spent $14 million proving its point. The New York Times said the following: the FBI has been justly criticized in recent years for erratic and often furtive behavior. Now listen to those words. In recent years, the FBI has been criticized for erratic and furtive behavior. Do you call killing 80 innocent people at Waco, Texas, erratic and furtive behavior? I don't. and I won't justify that behavior. And I think that the people who were responsible for it, even if it was an accident, should have gone to jail. I don't care that they're government officials. If I make a mistake at work, I can get fired. If I killed somebody, I would go to jail and possibly get the death sentence. And the same standard should apply to a federal government official who may accidentally kill 80 innocent men, women, and children.